When Sly Cooper gets brought up in a conversation, the majority of people tend to point out how much they connect with and celebrate its sequels, most notably the second and third game in the series, and there's a good reason for this. With some films, books, and most other forms of media, the old saying is that it's almost impossible to top the original if the original itself is cemented as a classic. But Sly Cooper is a series that honestly elevates itself so much higher with its sequels. You've got strengthened characters, you've got expanded worlds with missions that tie and contribute directly into the main narrative, you've got a greater aim to explore stealth and the full scope of being a thief. All of the groundwork from the first Sly goes on to become a lot more intuitive and ambitious in later games. So this might be what steals the attention from the first game in some ways. Objectively, the first game may not be as impressive, but in my eyes it gets a little underestimated. I think it should be commended for how well it differentiates itself from other platformers of its time, despite being slightly derivative and structurally similar in many areas of gameplay to ones of the late 90s. Aside from the obvious 3D platformer tropes, the first Sly game isn't comparable to any other game and has a unique identity when you examine its visual aesthetics, atmosphere, narrative, and thematic content. It walks the line between being refreshingly original and something familiar to its genre. I don't think you could appreciate everything the Sly Cooper series is without first acknowledging the roots it stemmed from, and that's what I love so much about Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. It's a different experience from the rest in the series because of how its gameplay formula plays out in a more standard fashion, but it was also part of a fresh breed of more conceptually interesting games in the genre of 3D platforming alongside Ratchet & Clank and Jak and Daxter. Unfortunately, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus fell through the cracks at its release commercially when stacked up against its rival platformers, and I don't think this is any fault of its own. The leg up for Ratchet and Jak to succeed was that their development studios, Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog, were well known for their work and success on the Crash and Spyro franchises from the PS1 era, which earned them a spot in the limelight and consumers who were looking forward to what they would do next. By contrast, Sly's developer Sucker Punch had one game on the N64, which was Rocket Robot on Wheels, and this game, despite being widely appreciated by critics, wasn't heard loudly in the industry, and to this day, it's incredibly obscure. Sucker Punch weren't known for blockbuster games just yet like they are today when you look at infamous Second Son and Ghost of Tsushima. In the PS2 days, I'd go as far as to say that Sly Cooper was the underdog of the mascot bunch, so you can't help but to cheer it on for its accomplishments. It went against all the odds to flourish as a series that no one really took notice of. The first game bombed pretty badly and was almost the only one of its kind until Sony gave Sucker Punch a second chance to make the series a hit. But what would a world look like where we only had one Sly game to remember and the series never took off? Would Sly Cooper still be as well remembered and celebrated as it is today by players, or would it have been overshadowed by the 3D platformers that were much bigger successes from their inception like Ratchet and Clank? I would argue that the first game, had it been the only Sly game, wouldn't have faded out. In fact, it would have grown over time and evolved into a cult classic similar to games like Beyond Good and Evil and Psychonauts. Thankfully, it did spawn sequels, which are still the objectively superior games in the series, but the first Sly is still worthy of praise. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus didn't overhaul the image of a 3D platformer like a few others attempted to do during this era, such as Jak 2 and Vex. It goes for a gritty story and ambience, but it doesn't forsake the lightheartedness and family-friendly appeal the genre is known for. It seamlessly blends it all together in the most natural way. What the original Sly Cooper achieves ever so slightly better than any other 3D platformer of its time is subtlety and a greater sense of purpose for everything that shapes the experience. There is subtlety, artistry, and purpose to every facet of this game. It's in Sly's acrobatic moveset and how it perfectly portrays his thieving skills. This is a platforming mechanic that has a great contextual reason to be used and function the way it does based on who we know of Sly as a character. It's in the environments, how you interact with them, and how they're drawn from actual settings with stylistic touches of fantasy. It's in the characters and how each one has a convincing personality and motivation for who they are and everything they do in the story. They don't need an excuse to be present because these characters, though they are larger than life, feel alive and grounded in their own fantasy world. Very few things feel like filler for a typical 3D platformer. There's the occasional frustrating mini-games that take you out of the moment for a minute, but most of what you see in play is there to be a captivating and integral part of the the entire package, and if one part of his commitment to detail was sacrificed, it would ruin or lessen the quality of the experience. Sucker Punch were on the ball, and for their second newly established IP, this was a fantastic effort. This level of effort and well beyond it is seen in Sly 2 and 3, but you can't praise those games without praising what they were built upon, and that's exactly why the first Sly game was so much more important to the series than you'd think. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus inspired me a lot as an artist and cherisher of art in all of its forms. It's a shining example of how to use the various things that inspire you and mix them together to create a new piece of art that feels cohesive and creative. From graphic novels to comic books to cartoons spun off from comic books to noir to heist films to animated films, there's so much Sucker Punch chose to use as a clear source of inspiration, and all of it served to create a compelling and vibrant universe that felt so well developed. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus applies a fresh coat of paint to the traditional 3D platforming mold, whereas Sly 2 flips the genre on its head, makes more bold choices, and takes more risks than the first. The first Sly Cooper was like a baby step in the direction of allowing a video game to take things much farther in terms of character-driven stories and world building. It bugs me a bit that Sly Cooper never gets any credit for this in the industry, but that boils down to Sly Cooper's status as a legendary series with no mainstream attention. Sly Cooper's impact is pretty visible in games like Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, and Sucker Punch's own Infamous that lift a lot of mechanics and take a few storytelling cues from it. My conclusion is that Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus may not be the most innovative game in the world or the most groundbreaking, but it's certainly one of the most stylish and broadly appealing traditional 3D platformers that came from a time when it seemed like the genre was either completely relaunching itself or starting to lose steam. What are your thoughts on the original Sly Cooper? Do you see it as the weakest game in the series, or is it just as impactful as the others? My opinion is the latter. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Matty, and for Sly Cooper related content and more, subscribe to Savo Central.